Thanks, Jamie, for that kind introduction. And let me just say what a pleasure it is to join you all on this wonderful summer's day here in Chicago for your meeting and discussion of global food issues. This is really an issue that at Oxfam is at the heart of everything we do, at the heart of our mission. So it's a real pleasure for me to be able to share with you our work and our views on this subject. I appreciate the fact that you didn't schedule this discussion or talk around the three-course meal, because it always feels a bit challenging to motivate folks on the subject of global hunger while they're eating a handsome meal. I'm particularly delighted with the idea that you all are here to look at this issue and perhaps develop teaching materials that might be used at the elementary or secondary level, and to open up your students to this subject matter. At Oxfam, we really think it's critical that we bring, if you will, the younger generation into these issues and give them some exposure to some of the complexities that I'll talk to you about this morning. For too long, I think, we've been comfortable or satisfied to view hunger and global food security as an issue that can be addressed via charity alone or charitable solutions. And we have nothing against charity, but I think our experience has taught us that the issue is far more complex, and charity alone is not a sufficient solution. In our view, actually, the problem of hunger and global hunger is more about market failure, about political power, about human rights, about misguided public policy, and about special interests. At Oxfam, our approach to this problem is what we would call a rights-based approach, and it's the way we address the issues of poverty and justice. We do this because we believe it gets us, or it enables us, to focus more on the root causes of these issues. And as Jamie said or alluded to, Oxfam is an organization that believes that there is a right to food, and it's codified in the UN Human Rights Charter. Unfortunately, however, most of the discussions of food ignore this fact and focus on agricultural productivity as the panacea, while ignoring the fact that many famines have occurred in places and at times where there was abundant food. Ireland, for example, exported tons of grain throughout the potato famine, while 1.5 million people starved to death. The Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen noted that there has never been a famine in a democracy. His point being that hunger and famines are not just about productivity. They are more often about rights and access, and about politics and policy. So in addressing the topic today, I will talk less about seeds and tools, not that they're not important, and I can talk about seeds and tools in the question and answer period if you like, but I probably will talk more about politics and policy, because that's where I believe we need to make the real change. My modest hope with these remarks is that I will perhaps help you to understand and connect the dots in understanding how the global food system works and why it failed in 2009 and is at risk of failing again. Looking at your schedule for these 2 days suggests to me that you're going to take a deep dive into many of the underlying issues driving today's global food crisis, those issues that Jamie just laid out. What I'd like to do in a very succinct fashion, in some ways, if you'll pardon the metaphor, is set the table for the discussions that you will have. So maybe quickly, what's on the menu? I'd like to provide a perspective on the drivers of the global food crisis that began in 2008. I'd like to sketch out a portrait for you of what it looks like on the ground, or what it did look like on the ground and still looks like in some places. I'd like to introduce you to Oxfam's GROW campaign, which is our effort to sort of raise awareness about these issues, and then offer some ideas of how you can help us address the root causes of this crisis. And I'm happy to sit with some of you over the lunch hour and talk a little bit more about how this you might do this in your classroom work. Last year, I chaired a plenary panel at the World Bank on the global food crisis. The first speaker in that panel was Robert Zoellick, the president of the World Bank. He started his remarks by stating bluntly to this audience of global experts that, quote, "We are one harvest away from a global catastrophe." Let me say that again. This is the president of the World Bank saying, we are one harvest away from a global catastrophe. And this is 2011, not 2008. This was a rather shocking comment from a man who was supposed to stay calm and speak in measured tones without adjectives about the state of the world economy. And he was making these remarks 2 years after the 2008 global food crisis. His message to the audience was that we discovered we had a very serious problem in 2008, and we've yet to fix it in 2011. So here was a call to arms from a leader who was paid not to make such statements. The fact that he made it in a public forum should tell us something about the severity of the crisis. Bottom line, the crisis is still with us in 2012, and its root causes have yet to be entirely addressed. And that's, I think, the most important thing you need to remember, the fragility of the global food system in 2012. Before jumping into what we might do about global hunger, I think it's worth reflecting a moment on how we got into this mess. And I'd like to just ask if you could indulge me for a few moments while I offer you a little bit of history to kind of provide some situational background or context for you. Through the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, there were massive surpluses of grain on the international market. Here in the US, we had mountains of grain stored all over the Midwest that we as Americans could not consume here at home. The growth of these surpluses led to a push to export them. With the arrival of the Reagan administration and its strong free trade ideology, the message was sent to developing countries, hey guys, don't worry about growing food at home because there'll always be abundant, cheap food on the international market. Don't worry, there'll always be cheap food on the international market. So little by little, these countries bought into the idea of a free trade solution to national food supply, and they stopped investing in their agricultural sectors at home. Meanwhile, major donor nations stopped funding aid for agriculture in these countries. World Bank lending, for example, for agriculture in the 1970s, during the peak of the Green Revolution, was 40% of its lending portfolio. By 2008, when the crisis hit, it had plummeted to 4%, from 40% to 4%. And it was the same story for USAID and many of the other major donors who historically had supported agriculture in developing countries. The consequence of this move away from support to agriculture was the development of a very elaborate global food system that relied on moving very large surplus production of grains from a small number of major producer-exporter countries like the United States, Russia, Australia, etc., to a wide diversity of consumer nations, many of them poor nations. The big producers fed the system. Global corporations like Cargill and ADM moved the grain around the world and stored it in strategic locations. Global grain markets set prices. A new global system replaced domestic production and consumption. Chicago is, of course, as you probably all know, one of the epicenters of this globalized commodity trading system. In poor countries, many governments bought into this radical liberalization agenda and started privatizing all aspects of their agricultural sector. They closed state-supported lending programs for their small farmers. They dismantled their state-supported agricultural extension and research systems. And they cut funding to their agricultural universities and training centers. And subsidized exports poured in, and small farmers threw in the towel and migrated to the cities. And over time, governments of large and small countries became increasingly dependent on the cheap food promised through the global food system. A good example of all this is Haiti, which we all became very familiar with in the aftermath of the earthquake, which in 1970, Port-au-Prince was a city with 750,000 people. At the time the earthquake occurred, it was 3.5 million, largely because all those small farmers that were growing rice when Haiti was self-sufficient in rice moved to the capital, and the country was flooded with American rice, subsidized American rice from Arkansas. And hence you had sort of this very densely populated city of Port-au-Prince, which couldn't really adequately house that population, and hence the dramatic scenes you saw in the earthquake scenario. Then 2008 happened. I like to call this the well-duh moment for economics in the international community. When the crisis first became apparent, I asked myself a very simple question, which was, how is it possible that with a world full of PhD economists and thoughtful environmentalists, major international institutions like the World Bank and the World Food Program, and the UN Food and Agricultural Organization that's charged with gathering data on global food supply and global commodity markets, and over 50 bilateral aid agencies, the world could not foresee the possibility of a global food crisis. It's pretty amazing when you think about it. The sudden collapse of global food markets are even more amazing when you realize that much of the data that you would need to figure this out was staring us in the face for over a decade. And let me give you sort of some examples of what I mean by that. We knew about a 10-year drought in the Australia wheat regions that had been gradually driving up global wheat prices. We all knew about the rapidly increasing price of fossil fuels. We knew about the new biofuels mandates and their impact on food prices. We knew about the changing consumption and purchasing patterns in China and India. We knew about the diminished global stocks and surpluses. Yet somehow, we didn't connect the dots. We did not see the obvious market linkages between these facts and their obvious impacts on commodity pricing. Somehow, perhaps those charged with paying attention just assumed that the market could be infinitely stretched to meet all our needs. Supply would respond to pricing signals and all would be well. The simple-minded economist's view of the world. Price can and will fix any problem. And when it can't, well, it's the politician's fault. So suddenly we were overtaken by the perfect storm as all these factors collided to create the 2008 crisis. And in an instant, we watched in horror as the market began to fissure and crack and global food prices skyrocketed some 300%. Any political leader will tell you that food is a national security issue. It's one of the most important things they have to worry about, particularly in the capital city. If children are hungry, people are capable of doing absolutely anything. And they did. There were riots in 38 countries in 2008 during the food price crisis. Given our obsession with national security in the aftermath of 2011, it's amazing that we could entirely miss the potential destabilizing effect of a food crisis of this magnitude. A closer look, for example, at the crisis in Tunisia points to the fact that the price of food was one of the precipitating factors. And this is not a problem that is going to be fixed overnight, and it's not a problem that's going to be fixed by sending in a lot of soldiers in armored troop carriers. And it is a challenge that could produce profound consequences for hundreds of millions of families, shape the future of nations, and be a source of serious conflict in some of the most poor and unstable areas of the world. So what was the effect on real people of this systemic crisis? This graph shows the dramatic nature of the swings in prices. The rapid increase in food prices in 2008 sent shockwaves through national economies and poor households around the world. This is what price volatility looks like. Note the peaks and the valleys. You want that line to be somewhat flat and straight. You don't want it to look like that. Nearly every agricultural commodity was part of the rising price trend. Wheat and corn prices doubled. Rice prices tripled in 2008. Dairy products, meat, poultry, palm oil, and cassava also experienced price hikes. The price increases for wheat, rice, and maize since 2006 cost developing countries $324 billion in 2007 alone, 3 times what was provided to them in development assistance that year. And what did it mean on the ground for people sort of living with this price crisis? To put it in some perspective, we need to remember that 40% of the world's 6 billion population lives on less than $2 a day. The majority of that 2 billion population spend on average over half of their income on food. When you realize how stretched these poor families are, you can begin to appreciate how such dramatic price spikes could force prices to levels out of reach for many of these families. An important thing to remember, however, is that the problem was and is not about necessarily a lack of food in the global marketplace. It is really about the fact that poor families and nations can no longer afford to buy the food that is available. In other words, it wasn't a global food crisis in terms of availability, it was a global food price crisis. Important to make that distinction. The families that I'm talking about have limited disposable income and no savings. They're, for the most part, living on the edge. While a price spike for us may mean perhaps a marginal increase in the percent of our income that we spend on food from 10 to 12%, we don't really feel it. For them, it may mean an increase from 50 to 75%. And it could mean making some serious choices. It could mean choosing between eating or buying medicine for a sick child, or eating or losing one's home, or eating and sending a child to school. And it's probably hard for us to actually contemplate facing these kind of choices, but these are the day-to-day choices that are and decisions that are being made by people, by some 2 billion people around the world that were faced with this global food price crisis. So let's take a couple of countries or regions in particular and maybe just focus on them for a brief moment. Let's take Bangladesh, for example. There, rice prices increased by 60% in 2008. An average Bangladeshi family of 5 living on $1 a day per member will generally spend $3 on food out of that $5. They'll spend 50 cents on household energy and $1.50 on non-food items. A 50% increase in food and energy prices requires them to cut $1.75 of their expenditures. Most of these cuts will be made in food expenditures, reducing dietary quality and increasing micronutrient malnutrition. So you can immediately see the impact of a price spike of this magnitude on household income when you're spending over 50% or more of your income on food. Such price increases not only increase poverty and malnutrition, but they also increase inequality, as large farmers benefit from the higher prices for the rice, while smaller farmers who cannot afford the inputs to produce at high prices gain less. In East and Southern Africa, 12 million AIDS orphans are amongst those most vulnerable to rising food prices. Older children will drop out of school in search of work, and the meager income it provides to help families keep afloat. In the depth of the crisis, many had to sell off valuable assets, such as seeds for the next season's planting, or goats and cows, and doors and windows from their homes in order to eat. And finally, perhaps the most dramatic example, in Haiti, where 2/3 of the population lives on less than $1 a day, the poorest resorted to eating mud cakes. Yes, mud cakes. On the flip side of all of this, it's important to note that poor farming families could potentially benefit from the increase in prices, in theory. But given the weak institutional support that's available to small farmers in most poor nations, this is by no means a certainty. And why not? Small farmers, particularly in poor nations, lack access to agricultural credit and extension because, as I said earlier, it disappeared with the liberalization policies of the 80s and 90s. Market roads are poor or non-existent. Inputs are costly because of spikes in the marketplace, and these small farmers lack the capital to buy those more expensive inputs. These conditions make it difficult for the small farmer to move quickly and to take advantage of favorable changes in the marketplace, which therefore advantages the larger farmer and increases inequality, as I said. Let me offer a few words on other factors that are contributing to these dramatic spikes in food prices that maybe are less evident to you. While it's not immediately obvious, there's a dangerous link, a pernicious link, between energy and food prices. In 2009, oil prices soared to $1.47 a barrel. When oil prices go up, they drive increases in the cost of fertilizer, pesticides, herbicides, and freight. Countries relying on food and oil inputs, therefore, find themselves in a real fix. They've got to import a significant portion of their food to feed their population, fuel to run their transport systems, and agricultural inputs to ensure productivity of their farmers. And they have to do this all at historically high prices because all of these areas are being affected by the price of oil. These costs are having a devastating impact on the national treasuries of poor nations. They're melting down their foreign exchange accounts, wiping out much of the progress we had made in debt relief for poor countries in the late 90s, and undermining their ability to achieve the Millennium Development Goals. Dependence on fossil fuel-based agriculture is unsustainable for most poor nations. Energy independence for them may be as important for them as it is for us, but for perhaps different reasons. And then there's the biofuels question. Biofuels is a good example of good intentions gone astray. Pushed initially by environmentalists as a low-carbon alternative to fossil fuel, the US and the EU passed measures requiring that 10 to 15% of all gasoline sold be either corn or sugar ethanol based. The market exploded. And when next time you go to the gas station, look at the decal on the gas tank, which actually tells you about this 10% of ethanol that's in the gas tank. And it's mandated under US law to go up to 15% in the not-too-distant future. The growth in the biofuels market has created, for the first time in history, a very direct and competitive link between the markets for food and fuel. With corn, palm oil, and sugar as the new sources of cheap fuel, we've created a set of highly dangerous and perverse market incentives. The International Food Policy Research Institute in Washington, D.C. estimated that 30% of the 2008 food price spikes were due to the emergent biofuels market. And just to give you a sense of what's going on in terms of the scale of the growth of this market, Here in the US, we've got 85 biofuel plants that were in production in around 2008, and there were 120 more that were under construction, mostly here in the Midwest and subsidized by US government money. So there was an explosion in the building of these processing plants to actually handle not only the 10% in our gas tank, but the increase to 15% in the future. We're seeing similar patterns in West Africa and parts of Asia where whole farming systems are being overturned and forest ecosystems compromised in a race to establish production facilities to meet the European biofuel demand. We're growing the corn here for our own use, but Europeans are basically deriving biofuel from production in Africa. The Chinese and the Indians have yet to enter the biofuel market in any significant way, but this is not far down the road. And try to imagine the impact that it will have when the Chinese and the Indians start putting biofuel-sourced fuel in their cars. As this market intensifies, there will be tremendous pressure in many developing countries to shift from food production to production for the biofuels market. In other words, stop producing food and start producing the product that you can put in your gas tank. While this may generate income in the short term for countries in need of foreign exchange, it will take valuable farmland out of production. Over time, it may force them to increase the volumes and percentages of imported food they must buy on the international market to provide for the food security of their populations and minimize political unrest. In other words, you might get growth in biofuel production in a country that then has a food deficit that it has to go into the international market and buy the food at expensive prices, so it doesn't actually solve their problem. The bottom line is that the relationship between energy and agriculture is undergoing a profound structural change on a global level. And we need to find ways in the near future to break this link and do it as soon as we possibly can. Another pressure on global food prices are the changing consumption patterns of Chinese and Indian consumers. An exploding middle class in both of these countries is suddenly eating up the food chain. Chicken and pork are becoming a bigger part of their national diets. The Chinese alone are buying up 2/3 of the Brazilian soy crop every year to feed their pigs and chickens. While not a principal driver of the 2008 crisis, it's clear that in the future, the desire of these populations for more enriched meat and protein products is going to have a substantial effect on global pricing. And if the convergence of food and energy prices were not enough to push most poor countries to the edge, climate change and its impacts on their economies certainly will. Climate change is both a cause and a consequence of many of the same variables impacting food, water, and energy shortages. Irrigated agriculture, for example, accounts for 40% of global food production and accounts for 70% of global water use. It's unclear, however, whether these irrigated systems that are providing much of the grain that we eat that comes from around the world can survive dramatic changes in rain patterns and climate and continue to produce at the levels that they've been producing over the last decades. The remaining 60% of global food production is produced on what is referred to as rain-fed fields or rain-fed agriculture, which covers more than 80% of global agricultural land. In these regions, variations in precipitation and temperature resulting from climate change will affect crop productivity substantially. The International Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, which is the body that actually has sort of championed the climate change question, predicts that in some regions of the world, yields from rain-fed agriculture could decline by up to 50% by as early as 2020. 2020 is not very far off when you think about it. A good example of this kind of weather event was the drought in Russia in the summer of 2010, which dramatically affected global wheat prices. Policies and programs to mitigate harmful emissions and to support adaptation to climate change are going to be critical to any serious efforts to address the food, energy, water crisis. Without immediate steps and major funding to address this challenge, the anticipated hotter and drier conditions in the arid and semi-arid tropical zones will lead to epic humanitarian crises far more severe than what we've been accustomed to. And over the last year, you've seen this big crisis in the Horn of Africa that's been drought-related. We've sort of staunched it now for a bit, but there's a fear that it's going to come roaring back in the next year. There's another emerging food crisis across the Saheli part of Africa from Senegal through Mali and into Chad that we're watching very closely now, and it could affect some 18 million people. So these are examples of where these drought conditions are actually having direct effect on populations as we speak. So let's fast forward to 2012 and ask ourselves what did or did not happen over the last 4 years since this 2008 crisis. What's the good news and where have we made progress and where not? There have been lots of summits, as there always are, to discuss the problem. After a terrible drought and fires in Russia, which I mentioned, that drove wheat prices up, prices have in fact come down slightly. They are, however, nowhere near where they were before 2008. Global stocks have not been replenished to the needed levels, and some actually estimate that they won't be replenished for another 10 years to the levels that are really needed. Governments have emphasized, it's good news that many governments have picked up on this, and they've emphasized the need to reinvest in agriculture, in the agricultural sector. Specialized funds have been created at the World Bank, and contributions have been made by governments to those funds. But the disbursements to that fund are actually far short of the initial commitments made in 2008. Unfortunately, those funds are now running out, and despite a promise of replenishment by the Obama administration at the recent G8 meeting in Washington about 2 or 3 weeks ago, there was little in the way of reciprocal support that was offered by other G8 nations, with the exception of the UK. So only the US and the UK stepped up and added money to those important funds. Climate negotiations have stalled out and almost died. The Rio +20 meeting that's been going on all this week in Brazil is likely to prove inconsequential. All reports coming out of Rio would suggest that. So little hope that it's going to advance the broad climate change agenda. Erratic weather patterns are being observed all over the world. Energy prices continue to fluctuate. The good news is they're heading down now, but I wouldn't trade in your Prius for an SUV just yet. The experts are predicting that prices again will gradually rise to above $100 a barrel, and the midterm predictions are they're going to stay over $100 a barrel into the coming decade. So the bottom line here again is the root causes of the crisis have not been addressed. Hence, we are likely to see continued volatility in food pricing, and we're likely to see it for the foreseeable future unless serious steps are in fact taken. And to add to an already complex picture, there are two new factors that have emerged since 2008 that are adding further volatility to food markets. And I think some of them, these two, I think you're going to talk about later in the day, so this will come as no surprise to you. The first one is land speculation, or what some call land grabs. After the crisis in 2008, governments that had food deficits, in some sense, in their national economies and were unable to meet the nutritional needs of their citizens from domestic production began looking beyond their own borders to figure out ways to solve this problem. And they were looking for ways to buy or lease land in order to produce food for their populations. Some 1,800 such transactions have taken place over the last 5 to 7 years or so, representing some 215 million hectares of land that has been leased to investors representing private firms, governments, sovereign wealth funds, and pension funds. Saudi Arabia leases land in Ethiopia, Korea leases land in Mozambique, Taiwan and Madagascar, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Most of these transactions are not widely publicized within the countries where they're taking place, so their citizens are unaware that their governments are mortgaging their productive land to third-party investors, or you might say mortgaging their future. The lands that are being leased are fertile lands with water supply. They're not marginal lands. In some cases, families with titles are being driven off the land. But the good news is the issue's finally surfaced. The World Bank did a study on the subject. Oxfam, along with others, is highlighting it in the hope of slowing down the process, making it more transparent. And other NGOs are questioning government practices as well. So it's out in the open, it's being discussed. The second new factor is commodity price speculation. With financial markets being in the tank and equities an uncertain investment vehicle for the high-risk investor, we now see hedge fund and derivative investors betting on commodity price fluctuations. Their presence in the market has added dangerous additional volatility to an already volatile market. The problem with this kind of speculation is that it's off-market trading, conducted in the shadows and not in the formal, transparent, regulated markets. Hence, there's no data on the amount of money flowing into this market and flowing out, and it's hard to establish a direct link between the invisible investing behavior of the speculators. When queried on the impact of this trading on market prices, Robert Zoellick, again the president of the World Bank, commented that while we cannot establish a direct causal link, we can assume at a minimum that there is a significant, in his words, boost effect on prices. The challenge for activists is to force this kind of commodity trading out of the shadows and regulate its more pernicious effects. So no matter how we view the present situation, there are hundreds of millions of people whose lives are directly affected by this systemic market volatility. Top of mind should be the reality that whatever food system we put in place to replace today's broken system must provide adequate food for all adequate food for all of 9 billion by 2050. In other words, this in some ways maybe is the number you should remember. We're going to be a world population of 9 billion by 2050. And the question is, we've got a broken food system now with depleted stocks. So how do we get from a crisis situation now in a fragile global food system to 2050 and feeding 9 billion people? What's the path to get there? That's really, I think, the big question. If you take anything away from this conversation and you say anything to your students, it's put that 9 billion number on the board and say, how are we going to get from here to there and feed 9 billion people? So how are we going to wrap our minds around this problem? What can we realistically do? Well, first, I think we need to take on board the fact that we're dealing with a deep structural systemic crisis. Our current global food system is broken, and if we're to deliver on, as we would say, the right to food for all people, we need to fix the system and tackle its core structural flaws. This is urgent and requires action by all of us now. What is not at stake is not only the food security of billions, but the very sustainability of the planet. Most analysts are predicting a continuation of high food prices for some time to come. Intelligence analysts and corporate strategists have already identified it as a major threat to national security and business growth. So we might think, for the next decade, we might actually have to take on board the idea that volatility may be the new normal. But this is a trend we've got to tackle head on. We've got to be aware of it and take it on. Boom or bust economics of the sort being championed by some of our political leadership today is a death sentence for the world's poor at home and abroad. T. Boone Pickens, the well-known Texas oilman, has been very clear that the days of cheap oil are over. He's now investing his billions into wind energy. Similarly, water scarcity in much of the world will continue to be a major challenge. And even greater numbers of Indian and Chinese will enter the middle class and begin to eat up the food chain, putting even greater pressure on global food supplies. There's no action to slow land grabs in developing countries yet, and there's no clear agenda to regulate commodity price speculation on the horizon. It wasn't long ago that, for example, that many saw biofuels as a huge opportunity for smallholders in poor countries. We now see biofuels in an entirely different and less favorable light. So the principal drivers of this crisis are still in place, and there's no doubt that food insecurity will remain at the top of the international agenda for years to come. Food prices will remain high, and many of the most food insecure areas will face even harsher conditions in efforts to increase local food production. So given the complex dynamics among these causal factors, it's going to be very difficult to achieve a consensus on a way forward. Constant reassessment of policies and the investments of future responses are going to be essential. So how do those of us who are in the human rights community as activists tackle a large systemic challenge like food security? Well, the good news is that there are many others thinking about and working on these issues. And they're not just taking traditional approaches of trying to figure out how to feed people through some charitable approach, but are rather digging into some discussion and study of these root causes. They are becoming a global movement, if you will, to which each of us in our own particular way can add our voices. And here I'd like to just introduce you to Oxfam's GROW campaign. And again, I'm happy to talk about this a bit more over lunch. GROW is Oxfam's new campaign to join this global movement, this emerging global movement, and add our voice to the fight for better ways to grow, share, and live together. It's Oxfam's biggest campaign ever. We began this year with campaign activities in some 32 countries. Our intent is to fight for solutions for a more hopeful future in which everyone has enough to eat always. The world is at a crucial turning point. To meet humankind's future food needs and take the pressure off non-renewable planetary resources, we need to grow more, grow it fairly, and grow it sustainably. We need to choose effective solutions over failed ideas, and we need to be united boldly behind a coherent long-term vision founded on sustainability, equity, and transparency. There's a powerful few, including some politicians and businesses that benefit from the status quo, argue tenaciously that the answer is more of the same. They offer the same old ideas and the same failed programs. They offer productivity and technology as the magic bullet. They champion more and more investment in an industrial agriculture controlled by a few big companies that is highly dependent on fossil fuel and abundant supplies of water. Obviously, fuel is getting more expensive and the water is getting scarcer, so there's a crisis brewing right there. They aggressively defend more giveaways of tax money to the biofuels industry, hooked on handouts that encourage us to divert food from mouths to cars. They lobby shamelessly for shipping companies that ensure 50 cents of every dollar in emergency food aid never gets to people who need it. They pander to enormous agribusiness companies hidden from public view that govern our food supply, ruling markets, setting prices, who are accountable to no one. But we know from years of experience, these approaches are not addressing root causes. Instead, we need to begin to find sustainable solutions that are actually fit for the future, fit for this 20th century world. Solutions like the Sustainable Rice System, or SRI, which is spreading through Asia and Africa, helping small farmers to produce more with less. SRI has been shown to double farmer incomes and boost yields by 50%, all while using 25 to 50% less water and lower production costs by 25%. Or solutions like the Zero Hunger campaign in Brazil that cut hunger by a third. Solutions found in countries like Vietnam, which achieved the first millennium goal to have hunger 5 years ahead of schedule. Brazil and Vietnam are proof positive that local solutions mixed with political leadership and public momentum can in fact turn these immense threats to our future into a foundation for hope and prosperity. To build this age of prosperity, we must attack our problems at the core, because food justice, if fundamentally a political and rights issue, requires political solutions. It is about the right to food for all people, no matter what their economic status. To legitimize this right to food on a global level, we must target governments, well-known and powerful companies, and global forums like the G20 summit. We must name and shame those who are failing, support those who are building a new vision, and create more space for strong leaders to be bold. Here in the US, this campaign begins with a 5-point plan for the future. These 5 immediate actions by President Obama, the Congress, and the private sector begin to address the emergencies that are on our doorstep. They treat the crisis like the emergency that, in fact, it is. And honestly, taken alone, they're not going to address every dimension of the problem, but they're an important start down the road toward addressing root causes. We start with the premise that it's important to invest in small farmers. Approximately 80% of the world's hungry people live in rural areas, where most depend on food production for their livelihoods. Yet they lack the resources to grow or buy enough to feed their families, and face increasing risks from extreme weather, droughts, and floods. Investing in small-scale food producers is the best way to achieve global food security and reduce poverty through economic growth. Efforts to rebuild food security need to begin with major new investments in agricultural production and increased attention to developing a policy framework which ensures that farmers have access to markets, as well as access to improved technologies and fair deals in the commodities they export. The sharp increase in fertilizer prices, combined with rising costs of fuel for irrigation and transportation, have raised the cost of food and grain production. As a result, many small farmers are being forced to reduce their use of inputs and/or their plantings. To move forward with these kinds of proposals will require moving beyond simple short-term technical and market fixes that the World Bank and AID, USAID, and others have long supported. These institutions will perforce play a critical role in responses to the crisis. It is essential, however, that they undertake in-depth reviews of their policy failures from the past and how they've contributed to today's crisis, and develop new approaches that take a more realistic and less ideologically driven approach to advancing agricultural productivity. In the development of new programs and policies, much greater attention will need to be given to the political economy of food and agriculture, which has led to the gross distortions in terms of trade, massive underinvestment in farmer-centered research, extension, and education, and biased policy processes that have failed to meet the needs of the majority of poor people, both producers and consumers in developing countries. Excessive speculation, as I mentioned, distorts the functioning of future markets by disconnecting prices from market fundamentals and by amplifying food price volatility. This undermines the livelihoods of small-scale farmers by reducing their ability to effectively manage risk and participate in the marketplace. The U.S. government and investors must begin immediately reining in excessive speculation in agricultural commodities and inject sorely needed transparency into the investment system. Helping nations during the food crisis is an essential part of U.S. foreign policy. During these major famines, the United States is a major contributor, and our contributions reduce instability around the world and protect the most vulnerable communities from catastrophe. And I think probably it's important for all of you to know that the United States is, in fact, the largest food aid contributor in the world. But at the same time, I think it's also fair to say, and I think you may have already heard a bit of this, that the current U.S. food system is broken and in need of some repair. And maybe just to describe that briefly, rather than allowing U.S. missions or embassies in developing countries, and particularly those in famine areas, to use cash to purchase food in local markets and rush it to famine areas, Current law requires the USDA to purchase grains from U.S. farmers and ship it on U.S.-owned ships to famine-affected countries. This outdated and self-interested approach is inefficient, wastes 50 cents of every taxpayer's dollar on expensive shipping costs, and forfeits the opportunity to stimulate the local economy with cash infusions. And it risks massive loss of life because of the lengthy delivery time, sometimes as long as a month or 2 months to get the food there. It is a ridiculous anachronism that both Republican and Democratic presidents have tried to change. Reforms that deliver more nutritious food, allow for local and regional purchase of food aid, and eliminate the U.S. Vessel shipping requirements will help save time, save lives, and save U.S. tax dollars while reducing dependence on aid over the long term. In the Senate, Farm Bill voted on last week. The Senate made local purchase programs permanent. In other words, it actually has institutionalized the idea that this local purchase idea is a good idea, finally. And they also provided limited funding for expanding the program over the next 5 years. So that's good news. It wasn't a lot of money, but it is some money. So basically they're establishing the principle. What remains to be seen, however, is what's going to happen in the House of Representatives bill, and when these two bills come together, whether this reform of the food aid system will actually, in fact, survive in the Congress. But there has been some movement on this question. And your involvement around this particular issue is something that could be meaningful. The U.S. federal biofuels mandate and industry tax breaks, which cost taxpayers $6 billion a year, are driving up food prices, contributing to increased price volatility, and increasing greenhouse gas emissions, all the while having no impact on U.S. oil dependence. Subsidizing oil companies to blend ethanol is wasteful, unnecessary, and damaging to consumers all around the world. Currently, 40%, let me repeat that, 40% of the U.S. corn harvest is devoted to ethanol production, raising corn prices in the U.S. and around the world. We've got to put an end, really, to these giveaways and refocus our investments on technologies that do not undermine food security. The good news is that this year Congress cut subsidies to the ethanol industry in response to external pressure. However, it has left in place the 10% mandate, soon to be a 15% mandate in the near future. So that's something, again, we could be focusing on. The increased drive by investors, companies, and governments for valuable farmland in developing countries is posing a serious threat to the rights and livelihoods of small-scale food producers, especially women. And it's most often women who lack legal rights and can be forced off the land without any means to support their families. While investment in agricultural production and infrastructure and market development is desperately needed, 80% of recent land investments remain undeveloped, and these large-scale acquisitions too often result in poor communities having reduced access to land and water. And as the hunt for land and water heats up, full application of the norms of transparency and free, prior, and informed consent, in other words, enabling communities to know that their land is under consideration for these kind of long-term leasing arrangements, must be embedded into the politics and practices of farmland and water acquisitions of governments, companies, and other relevant institutions. So what lessons are there for us in today's crisis that may enable us to deal more effectively with tomorrow's more substantial crisis? First, we must recognize that the world consistently fails to adequately address the underlying structural causes of these crises. Second, we need to understand that market failure is a major cause of chronic poverty and hunger, and that government in both rich and poor countries will need to invest in concerted action to tackle the underlying structural causes of these problems if we're going to make real progress. In terms of real action, this means we need to continue to act to save lives in the short term through support for the kinds of humanitarian aid and food aid programs that the United States has so generously contributed to over the years. But we need to make these programs smarter and more efficient through a transition of some of our investments to local purchase of commodities. Third, we need to begin to make strategic long-term investments in building the capacity of the agricultural sector in the poorest countries of the world. And finally, we need to reform our domestic agriculture, trade, and finance policies and join the international community in acknowledging the devastating impacts of climate change on millions of people around the world. Taking these initial 4 steps will move us in the direction of averting an ever deeper crisis on our global food security system over the coming decades. And I think there's probably no more urgent challenge facing our generation and the generation that will follow us. An African proverb actually captures the essence of the problem, I think, in very simple terms. When hunger gets inside you, nothing else can, is the proverb. In short, you can't think, you can't grow, and you can't prosper. And while there are clear measures we can take, moving on them will require clarity of vision and certainly a great deal of political will, and a moral compass pointed toward a concern for justice. And hopefully we, as a nation, as Americans, can come to appreciate the very central role we play in exacerbating this crisis, and the very central role we can play in alleviating it both in the short and the long term. And hopefully we can find a way to shape the will of our leaders to see that it is both in the interest of the United States as well as in the interest and well-being of the international community for the United States to take some tough policy decisions and make some sacrifices as a nation to address the daunting challenges of the global food crisis before it overtakes us again unawares and unprepared. So, the table's set for a good conversation. I thank you very much.
I liked that you started with the idea that in the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there is a right to adequate food sources. But the United States is kind of famous for not really recognizing the social, economic, and cultural rights in the UDHR. I was just wondering, in some of the summits that you've attended or some of the conversations that you've had, is there any recognition from this administration that it is, in fact, a human right?
Yeah, this is actually an important question, and I'm actually going to back up a little bit and again offer a little bit of history. When the Human Rights Charter was put together in 1948, it had a number of different components that addressed civil and political rights as well as social, economic, and cultural rights. And interestingly, the elements of the UN Charter, if you go and read it, and I really encourage you to read it if you haven't, it's interesting. Amnesty International a few years ago did a test inside their organization of how many people had actually read the Human Rights Charter, and they actually found that it was a rather low percentage. So for those of us who talk about it, we should at least read it because it's a really important global document. But and afterwards, everyone read that. After that poll, everyone read the charter. But the interesting thing was the social and economic rights portion of the UN Charter was there because it was championed by Eleanor Roosevelt. She championed the social and economic and cultural rights provisions of the UN Charter. And paradoxically, in the Cold War era of the 1950s and 60s, the United States adopted a political perspective, which was human rights is defined as political and civil rights, and social, economic, and cultural rights are what those other people do that live in Russia and China. You know, they worry about social, economic, and cultural rights, but they don't worry about political and civil rights. We worry about political and civil rights, but we don't believe in social, economic, and cultural rights. So we ended up creating this cleavage between these rights domains. And what's happened, I think, over the last 2 decades is with the fall of the Berlin Wall, there's been a revisiting of the Charter and a re-energizing of the discussion about, well, wait a minute, the original Charter actually involves all of these rights. They should all be taken together, and they're mutually reinforcing. And I think that's been a very healthy discussion within the human rights community. And in fact, you now have this notion of the right to food as something that's been incorporated, for example, in India. I think you're going to talk a little bit about this later. India has actually adopted the notion that the right to food is a right. How the state actually assists its citizens in realizing that right is another question, but it gives citizens an opportunity to challenge their government to make good on that as part of the social contract. And the rights, and having the rights identified as such, enables a civil conversation to go on about the ability of a government, or the ability of citizens to appeal to their government or redress their government on the basis of that question. So if you go to India, you'll find that there actually are, feeding programs for. I was in a community of untouchables in Bihar several months ago, probably in March. And we sat under a tree and talked for quite some time about the government's food aid program to this very poor, untouchable community under this framework of the right to food in that country. And in European countries, you'll also find it's begun to be embedded into national legislation. Here in the U.S., in Oxfam, we've defined ourselves as a rights-based organization, and we have challenged different administrations on this question of where are we in respect for social and economic rights. During the last administration, I ended up having a debate with the head of AID in a session on these issues, in which basically he point blank said that there was no such thing as social and economic and cultural rights, and that we don't recognize that as an administration, nor do we think that they're realistic in principle to execute. In some ways, it's kind of a way of, another way of putting that is, to actually acknowledge that is to actually, give ground to the notion of entitlement programs, what would be called entitlement programs in our kind of the U.S. kind of narrative. I think this administration currently, I think, understands the social, economic, and cultural rights agenda, and I think one of the ways you see it represented in the narrative that comes out of the administration is in the way that Hillary Clinton speaks about the global food issue, about women's rights. In other words, she doesn't come right out and say we're championing the social, economic, and cultural rights agenda, but she does it by the kinds of issues that she's championing as a Secretary of State. And we haven't had a Secretary of State, I think, before Hillary Clinton that has taken on this, the development agenda and these rights issues as directly and forthrightly as she has. But I think what she's tried to do is kind of walk this fine line within our political culture of not kind of going too far in the public recognition of it. So there's a subtle push in that direction, but there's also a recognition that there are elements within our society that would push back hard and try to hold to the political and civil rights definition of human rights and keep the social and economic and cultural rights issues off the books. That's a long answer to what was a good question. Sorry about that. Anybody else?
At one point in your presentation, you had mentioned that I think it was Vietnam and Brazil in particular had enacted policies that were sheltering them somewhat from the global food crisis. Could you comment on what exactly those policies are and why they're effective?
Yeah. Well, in the Brazil case, they actually had this national campaign called, in Portuguese, Zero Fome, which means the goal of the government was to have zero hunger in the country, no hunger. And they basically put together programs all over the country through state governments and through their various ministries to basically, assess where their big problems with food insecurity lay, and they basically decreased malnutrition in the country and made significant progress in trying to meet in having the malnutrition levels in the country. In other words, they embraced the Millennium Development Goal that speaks to the hunger question and then really made it a central policy issue in the country to eliminate it. So it was a major public policy initiative in the country. It wasn't so much that they were doing this before the food price crisis hit. In other words, this was something that was going on under the Lula government, and he's obviously now out of office, but during his 2 terms, this was one of the major initiatives that they undertook. And so and largely was a public policy initiative which kind of recognized the right to food and tried to execute a program on a national level. And the Vietnamese, it was a similar kind of thing. It was a national, in other words, the government embraced the idea that they wanted to address the hunger issue in the country. They did a national assessments of where there was critical need, and then they basically prioritized meeting the needs of those populations or those regions of the country where the greatest needs were met. And then, the assessments were, of success were done by the government, but also with some oversight of international organizations, so that there was some appreciation of the progress that they had made. I guess the point there being, these are countries that actually recognize this as a major national issue and then just put all of their energy behind that and made it a top national priority. That's really the point I was getting at. Not that they were able to shelter themselves from the buffeting of these other issues. I think these countries have also been affected to some degree by the volatility in the international marketplace starting in 2008. So I'm not excluding them from that, the effects of that, but I think they were in a better position to manage it, probably.
Yeah, as regards ethanol as a fuel, can you comment on its relative efficiency in terms of energy in and energy out? And as a follow-up, maybe some of the forces that are requiring its expansion and use?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is the paradox about the energy in, energy out question is one of the paradoxes in the ethanol question. I mean, initially, the argument was, let's put ethanol in the gas tank because it'll reduce carbon emissions. But the process of breaking down the organic matter you have to break down in order to get the ethanol actually releases as much carbon as you're gaining from the diminished amount of carbon that's coming out when you're burning the ethanol. So it actually ends up being kind of a net zero gain. And the environmental community has now recognized this. And while they championed it initially, now you won't hear them or see them out there championing it now. In fact, they lobby with us to kind of try to cut back on the use of ethanol. And the big conversation about ethanol is how fast can we get to what they call second generation biofuels? That is to say, there's a discussion you may hear sometimes about something called switchgrass. Switchgrass is a prairie grass that's grown here in the Midwest and toward the western states, eastern Colorado and Montana and so forth. It's a native grass, and it's high carbon content, and when broken down, it can actually serve as a good source of biofuel. The problem is the biology or the biochemistry that's involved in transitioning to something that's going to create ethanol in large quantity quickly, that's a substitute for the corn or sugar or palm oil sourcing, is not on the market yet. And if you get biochemists in the room, I know we have one here, they will actually debate. I mean, some of them will say, well, it's 3, 4, 5 years down the road. Others will basically say it's 20 years down the road. I've tended to hear more lean toward the idea that it's 20 years down the road than I have, than I've been persuaded that it's 5 years down the road. In other words, that it might be produced by algae, or that it might be, that we might be able to figure out ways to quickly break down switchgrass in large volumes. The other tricky part about using switchgrass, as opposed to, say, a biological solution that doesn't require use of land, is that if we start putting all sort of the Midwestern prairie into switchgrass for fuel, that means we're taking something else that's a food source out of production. So we have this displacement effect. And that's really the challenge. In other words, let's say, whatever country you're thinking about that might be considering a biofuel solution, wherever they plant the product that they're going to use for that biofuel base, they're not planting corn, they're not planting wheat, they're not planting rice, and yet their population and the demand for that food is increasing all the time. So if we can get to second generation biofuels, which don't require large land mass to produce, then we'd be in better shape. On the question of who's supporting the continuation, I think to some degree industry likes the subsidies, and so that's been an encouraging factor. And then you've got all the folks that who bet on the ethanol industry in the Midwest, who basically started putting the capital down to put up the processing plants, who now feel maybe they got out ahead of things. So they're trying to retain, the subsidies, or at least now maintain the mandates. So, but you've got a weaker constituency than you had in the past because the environmentalists have backed off it, and so it's largely, industry folks that are trying to still make the case that it's a better short-term solution than anything else we've got. So, if you're in Washington, sometimes you'll see posters on the bus stations, or little bus stops that are actually trying to pitch the virtues of ethanol, and they're usually from trade associations in D.C. that are pushing the case.
So you mentioned buying locally a little bit when you were talking about aid to other nations, and I know buying locally, of course, is something that's become popular among people who would like to restructure the food distribution within the U.S., and I'm curious how big a piece you see that is as part of the solution, is moving food distribution to local growth and local consumption.
Yeah. Well, there is, I guess, what you might call the locavore movement. I mean, it's sometimes known as that. I think the Oxfam view on that is it's important insofar as you can manage to supply an adequate supply of food that meets all nutritional needs in a market 12 months of the year. But actually, when you look around the world and you think about how many places you can actually meet all needs with a robust variety of products 12 months of the year, it's very difficult. So you're always going to be needing to move some commodities in and out. I think when I'm talking about local purchase, what I'm actually talking about is the reform of the food aid system, where I'll give you one wild example that was a little story that kind of, I think, makes the point. In the aftermath of the tsunami, there was this rush in Washington to presume that the countries in the tsunami-affected areas were going to have a big food shortage. So they invoked this food aid provision, and they made orders. The USDA made all these orders for rice from U.S. farmers, put them on ships, and then sent them to the Indian Ocean, and then delivered them to places like Sri Lanka. Well, if you visited the country, I was in Sri Lanka right after the tsunami. And basically, if you flew along the coastline low, what you saw was the tsunami came in about 300 meters all along the coast, all around pretty much 3/4 of the country. But anything beyond 300 meters, life was normal. So as it turned out, we shipped all this rice to Sri Lanka. We brought it to the port, sold it into the economy, and it turned out that Sri Lanka that year, because the rice is grown in sort of the highlands, wasn't affected by the tsunami. They had the biggest bumper crop in the history of the country, and our rice basically destroyed the price and wiped the farmers out. I mean, this is, but our farmers in Arkansas made a killing on it because basically they got, their rice was purchased at, at whatever world market price was at that time, which was subsidized. So, and there's a big debate in the U.S., I don't know how much you closely followed the Farm Bill, but there's a big debate about, farm subsidies, in the farm subsidy regime in our Farm Bill, and there was a real effort this time in the Farm Bill to actually cut back on those subsidies. And it's, to some degree, what they call the white crops, the sugar and rice and cotton are to some degree big beneficiaries of these subsidies. There was some effort to try to cut these back at this particular point in time, but this bill created other mechanisms, insurance mechanisms, that actually sustain versions of them in another fashion. It might be interesting for you to know that these subsidy regimes in the U.S. are basically viewed by the rest of the world as illegal under World Trade Organization free trade rules. And the United States was sued by the Brazilian government for its subsidy of its cotton crops. And the United States lost the case. It lost the case on appeal. And when it lost the case on appeal, it's actually, the Brazilian government therefore is allowed to impose penalties on the United States for breaking the law under the WTO arrangements. And the United States, rather than recognizing that they're in violation of the free trade agreements in the WTO, decided to pay the penalties to the Brazilian government. So every year we pay $146 million a year in penalties to the Brazilian government for having lost that case in order to sustain the subsidy regimes for the cotton farmers in the American South. So that's your tax money being just pounded down a rat hole in support of actually very big, very wealthy, subsidized cotton in the South that actually on the international market is not competitive. So anyway, just so you understand some of what's going on in that. So in the reform of the bill, what we're really talking about in terms of local purchase is the value of, say, in that Sri Lankan case, we could have bought Sri Lankan rice from the farmers that were literally a mile up the road and fed anybody that needed it in those lowland areas, and done it at a fraction of the cost and with almost no transport costs. But instead, we put it on ships in the Great Lakes, all the way up, across the ocean, down around South Africa, into the Indian Ocean, delivered it to Colombo, put it on trucks, shipped it out to these people. They didn't need it, collapsed the price, the farmers were killed. And so that's the logic of the program we have in place. That's why we say it's broken. And now there are cases where in some of these big emergencies you may need that food. So what we're really arguing for is not that it be done away with, but that the embassies in country be given the flexibility to use some portion of the money. So let's just say in the money that we have now that goes for that food aid program, if let me just put it this way. President Bush, who we worked with, recommended that 25% of the money for food aid go for local purchase, 25%. And the rest, the other 75%, be kept for those emergencies where local purchase wasn't possible. And there are situations like that. And so we said, that's a good idea, let's support that. We couldn't get anything close to that. We basically, all we got in the last Farm Bill under President Bush, even with all his pressure and the pressure of the USDA secretary at that time, was basically a small fraction of that. So we're doing a little bit better now, however, in this bill.